Hello and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. Let's get into China currents where innovation is moving fast and sometimes faster than expected. China's robotics firm Unitree has smashed the humanoid robot speed record, pushing the limits of what machines can physically achieve. Meanwhile, a Chinese-made robot has gone viral overseas after being spotted chasing wild boars in Poland. An unusual but eye-catching display of real-world robotics in action. In the tech space, Agibot is lowering the barrier to entry by launching a no-code platform that allows anyone to program a robot, opening the door to a new wave of creators. And in healthcare, China's homegrown brain-computer interface system has been live-streamed during surgery for the very first time, marking a major step forward in medical transparency and innovation. There's so much to get into here on China Currents, so let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to China Currents. Let's just face it, this is a title so generic, I'm 90% sure it was generated by a robot, which is fitting because tonight's episode is just me begging you to believe that 5 things actually happened. Not haha, tech is crazy way, but I need to lie down way. This week in Chinese tech, a robot sprinted 80% as fast as Usain Bolt. Another robot chased wild boars in Poland. And people voluntarily live-streamed their own brain surgery. Okay, first story. On April 11th, Unitree Robotics released footage of their humanoid robot, the H1, running a 100-meter dash on a track like a person. Its top speed, 10 meters per second. That's a 10-second, 100-meter dash. A robot made of metal and wires. Usain Bolt's peak speed was 12.42 meters per second. So this robot is already at 80% of Bolt's all-time best. I just said that. A robot, 80% of Usain Bolt. And in a few months, probably less, I'll be telling a robot ran faster than him. And we'll just accept it, like we accepted that phones don't have buttons. Here's the part that really hurts. Last August, that same robot's record was 3.3 meters per second. And it took generations of robotic engineers to get there. And then 3.3 to 10 in under a year. That's a 3-fold increase. If humans improved that fast, I'd be an Olympic medalist by next quarter. But we don't, because we have bones. Unitree's founder predicts robots will break the 10-second barrier, outrunning Bolt, by mid-2026. Given they went from 3.3 to 10 in 8 months, that timeline is not just optimistic, it is conservative. So let me just say this to Usain Bolt. You had a good run, literally, but soon a robot with no hamstrings will do what you did without sweating, without that cushy shoe deal, and then it will be reprogrammed to chase wild boars in Poland, which coincidentally is our next story. So the killer app for a sprinting humanoid robot is apparently boar control in Poland. I'm not saying we over-engineered the future, but we definitely didn't optimize for this. And I promise you, I did not hallucinate this. On April the 13th, a video went viral out of Warsaw. It shows a Chinese-made humanoid robot, a robot, chasing 3 wild boars through a residential neighborhood. The boars are just wandering around, as boars do, looking for trash, like boars do. And then this metal figure just marches after them. The boars see it, and they nope the hell out. They bolt, no pun intended. And after successfully shooing them away, the robot turns around and waves goodbye. It waved goodbye. That is not animal control. That is someone accidentally dropping a Blade Runner extra into a BBC Nature documentary. David Attenborough would not know how to narrate. And here we see the wild boar fleeing from a small, polite automaton named Edward. Because that's the best part. This robot has a nickname. They call it Edward. Edward, darling, will you come back inside, please? Leave the bowl alone. We have people for that. Nothing that can chase a wild animal at speed should be named like it goes to a fancy public school in Surrey. You do not name a predator Edward. You name a predator Ripper or Stabby. Edward is a robot that does your taxes. But here we are. The robot, officially the G1, released in May 2024, is about 130 centimeters tall. That's 4'3". It weighs 35 kilograms, which is roughly 77 pounds. And it costs about $13,000. So let me just say, directly to any wild boar watching this show, and I know some of you are because you've got nothing but time and truffles. We love our viewers. If you get chased away by a 4'3", 77-pound baby robot named Edward, that's a career reassessment. Now, here's where it gets even weirder. Edward was already a minor celebrity in Warsaw before the boar incident. In late March, it delivered a speech in Polish parliament. I'm not making this up. A robot named Edward addressed elected officials. I don't know what it said, probably something about infrastructure, but that's not the point. Think about that. This robot has two jobs, chasing wild animals and giving parliamentary speeches. That is already a more competitive resume than most of the people in whatever it is that I do here every Wednesday. Warsaw is next to a national park, so wildlife strays into the city constantly. Local authorities have been experimenting with robots as a wildlife management tool, which is fine. But here's my question. If a robot can chase away boars and speak in parliament, what exactly are we for anymore? Are we just here to film it and say, "Aw, look at Edward go"? Because honestly, at this point, I'm not sure I'd win a head-to-head with Edward. He's faster than me, he's more articulate than me, and he doesn't need health insurance. The only advantage I have is that I can be disappointed in myself. And Edward seems very pleased with his life. Anyway, that's the boar-chasing, speech-giving, oddly polite robot from Poland. And that was one of the weird tech stories this week. We have 3 more. I need a drink. In automotive manufacturing, UB Tech's Walker S1 has completed operational trials at BYD factories, handling tasks like material transport and sorting, and has already secured over 500 units in purchase intent orders. Gaobot's humanoid robots are running around the clock at cattle and other factories, covering material handling, line inspection, and precision assembly. In more hazardous environments, State Grid has deployed specialized humanoid robots to conduct power line inspections in remote mountains under high voltage conditions, while explosion-proof firefighting robots are replacing human workers in toxic and dangerous rescue scenarios. The industry consensus is clear. Humanoid robots are finding their sweet spot in what's known as 3D jobs: dangerous, dirty, and dull. Precisely the roles where removing humans from harm's way matters the most, and what my dad calls the real jobs when I told him this is what I'm doing. From a viral street video in Warsaw to batch deployment on Chinese factory floors, humanoid robots are crossing a critical threshold. However, as entertaining as a robot named Edward chasing wild animals is, the real story is much less cinematic and much more real. On April 13th, a company called Agibot launched Genie Studio Agent. It's a no-code platform for programming robots. You drag and drop nodes on a visual interface like you're making a PowerPoint, except instead of boring your colleagues, you're teaching a metal humanoid to do actual work. So what used to require a robotics engineer now takes about as much effort as organizing your desktop icons. The robot learns in 3D simulation first, makes its mistakes in virtual spaces, so when it comes to the real world, it doesn't nervously poke a colleague and ask, "Hey, Mr. Wang, do we have insurance for that Yuan Dynasty vase you asked me to fix?" Agibot says the platform is already deployed in semiconductor factories, which means we've officially reached the point where deploying a robot app will soon feel like installing one on your phone. And historically, when something becomes that easy to scale, that's when the robots stop being a product and start being a platform. And that's when everyone else starts updating their LinkedIn. Anyway, next up, brain surgery as a live stream. Yes, really. On April 13th, Beijing Tiantan Hospital conducted China's first live public broadcast of an implantation surgery for the Beinao 1 brain-computer interface system. That's BCI. Yep, a computer in your brain, and they streamed it for education. Yes, at some point, even brain surgery becomes content. I now feel weirdly validated about my job and also deeply concerned for humanity. The system is semi-invasive, electrodes on the outer membrane of the brain, not poking the gray stuff directly. The implant is about the size of a coin, wirelessly charging, so no wires sticking out of her head, which is nice because no percutaneous wires is a sentence you never want to have to be grateful for. But here's the part that got me. Over the past year, Bainal 1 has been implanted in 7 patients. Cumulative in-body time, over 45,000 hours. No serious adverse events reported. So it's safe, I think, as far as I can tell. Now, the obvious question. Who watches brain surgery as a live stream? If your neighbor says that he was in the chat, move. Change your name because no one who casually watches a skull being opened for fun should know where you live. Okay, final story. And I'm already angry about it. On April the 13th, Geely unveiled their next generation hybrid powertrain, the IHEV. It's a direct challenge to Japanese automakers who've owned this market for decades. The numbers are genuinely absurd. Peak thermal efficiency, 48.41%. In engine terms, that's like getting New York lawyer billing hours out of a European work schedule. It just shouldn't happen, at least what my former bosses told me. Fuel consumption, 2.22 liters per 100 kilometers. That's a Guinness World Record achieved in real highway testing. Now, for those of you under 25 who just nodded like it's normal, I need you to understand something. There was a time, and remember it because I'm not a fetus, when 17 liters per 100 kilometers was considered pretty good, and you had to get up early in the dead of winter to preheat the engine while freezing your nose off, because your car either didn't have a heater or the heater wouldn't work until the engine was warm. So when I hear 2.22 liters, I don't feel hope, I feel rage, because you've never known struggle. You've never scraped ice off the inside of a windshield, and you'll never understand why I hate you. Anyway, the IHEV flips traditional hybrid logic, puts the electric motor in charge, uses AI to adjust fuel-electric strategy in real time based on temperature, humidity, altitude. Geely says it cuts energy consumption by over 10% compared to conventional hybrids, which means your car is now making better decisions than most corporate meetings you've ever attended. The system goes into production this year, global fuel prices are rising, and whether this helps a Chinese brand finally crack the hybrid segment, I don't know. But I know that I'm still bitter about that windshield ice, and I'm taking that bitterness with me to the credits. That's it for China Currents. We live in a time where robots are faster than Bolt, boars are fleeing from Edward, you can live stream your own brain surgery, and your car is now smarter than your boss. I need that drink now. Good night.
And now we move into Overlap, where perspectives from across the global south come together to unpack today's most pressing international issues. In this conversation, Belén de los Santos from Telesur and Chinese political commentator Tian Shen examine the ongoing conflict involving Iran and its far-reaching global implications. With tensions escalating and a US-led naval blockade disrupting key energy routes and global markets, they also take a closer look at the broader geopolitical landscape, including the latest round of US sanctions and the long-standing blockade against Cuba, and what these developments mean for international relations and economic stability. There's more.
Welcome to one more episode of Overlap here, this conversation from across the world. My name is Belén de los Santos from Telesur English in Havana, Cuba, and I am joined once again by Tian Zhang from Beijing. Hello, Tian Zhang. Thank you for joining us one more time in Overlap.
Hi, Belén. Nice talking to you. Nice to see you well and talk to you in these very challenging times.
It's always great to have these conversations. And today we are talking about oil. It seems that oil has marked the pace of this 2026 from the US attacks in Venezuela that Trump said was about the oil, to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz after the attacks on Iran, and everything that followed regarding the route of oil around the world, to the oil blockade in Cuba. It seems that that is one of the common factors, but not the only one. So we were wanted to just talk about how these things are interconnected, and particularly how we are looking at this from different sides of the world. So Jiang, just to open up this conversation, how is all of this being seen from China? Are these separate cases, or is there like a common route among all of these things that we have been seeing in this year, that it's only been a couple of months long, but a lot has happened?
Yeah, sure. I would say everything is connecting, is all connected, and is definitely like not a regional thing or an occasional thing. Is I just read an article published by Ray Dalio, a famous U.S. investor, a few days ago, and he said that we are on the way to the World War III. So there are a bunch of like shooting wars going on, and there is also a bunch of non-shooting wars like sanctions and different types of like trade bans going on. So Iran is just like the most recent and the most severe case we can think about right now. So on Chinese side, I think almost everyone is closely watching the situation of the war in Iran. The latest news I saw is like this week, Iran and the US agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, and Iran proposed a 10-point peace plan, and which includes like the lifting of all sanctions on Iran, and also continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, and also like including the U.S. military withdrawal from the Middle East, and so on. So at this moment, I think no one believed that these agreements could be reached between the two sides or three sides. If the U.S. were to accept all these terms proposed by Iran, it would effectively signal the end of its imperial dominance. It seems like we are still far from there. So for now, maybe both sides are simply looking for a chance to pass or to buy time, rather than sincerely seeking negotiations or settlement. So we do not know that where this war will ultimately lead. However, it already carries profound historical significance. I think it may signal the collapse of the whole petrodollar system, and of course, it will means an acceleration in the decline of U.S. hegemony, possibly much faster than most people expected before. Because the most important pillar of the petrodollar system is the U.S. commitment to provide security guarantees to these major oil-producing countries. So the U.S. Promised that it will protect their energy supplies, their infrastructure, their regimes, and of course, national securities. So the U.S. maintains military bases in these countries, and also sells them weapons at a very high price. In return, the oil is required to be priced and settled in US dollars, and these countries are expected to use these dollars to purchase US treasuries and also other US financial assets. However, this war till now has already shown the world that the US cannot provide sufficient security protection to these oil-producing countries. Their weapon systems have struggled to withstand Iran's low-cost attacks. And also the US military bases, the US enterprises, their data centers, anything associated with the US, even including Americans themselves, have become potential targets for Iran. So the US itself become a source of risk, no longer a protection. So if the oil producing countries cannot rely on US protection, why would they continue to adhere to the petrodollar system? So even the dumbest person may begin to consider alternatives, at the very least seeking to diversify risk and strengthen ties with countries other than the US, for example, China. So this week, I just read another fascinating report by a well-known US investment firm called Satrani Research. So the firm actually sent a financial analyst to the Strait of Hormuz for field research. So they actually counted the commercial ships. Like there are still commercial ships like really like passing the straits right now at this moment, and these countries like include India, Malaysia, Japan, Greece, France, and Turkey, and also of course China. So they are actually, these countries are already like talking to Iran and cooperating with Iran, and they pay some kind of like transit fee to get the commercial ships like passing through the strait. So we can see all these countries, a lot of countries are already exploring ways to bypass the petrodollar system, and Iran's control over the oil flows and the Strait of Hormuz appears much more tangible than the influence of the US dollar right now. So it turns out that this is not the first time that the US has faced setbacks in war, and not the first time they are kind of like stuck in a prolonged conflicts. However, it may be the first time that the entire world is collectively reassessing and questioning the role and function of the US actually played in the global economic system. So I'm not certain that how the war will develop the next stage, but I think so far that Iran has demonstrated that a very notable strategy, and it also demonstrated that it can actually effectively manage the Strait of Hormuz without the US. So as long as other countries are willing to cooperate with Iran, their ships can continue to pass through the strait. And it does not require any US involvement. It does not require to operating within the petrodollar system. So the war involving Iran right now is further reinforces the idea that there are multiple alternatives to the US dollar and to the petrodollar system. However, there are no real alternative for the oil itself or for the Strait of Hormuz. So as long as Iran does not compromise, the US has very limited options. So that's how my personally seeing the situation right now, and this may represent like some people in China see it.
It's so interesting what you were pointing out, and it of course aligns with what many analysts are saying regarding how this ceasefire came to be. Of course, as usual for the United States, but particularly for Donald Trump, they have tried to show the ceasefire as a personal win, but many analysts, even within the United States, and that is very interesting. We have been talking about this for other topics as well, and definitely this is the year in which we are particularly following what is happening within the United States as well, because everything of all the consequences that you were just pointing out are also having repercussions within the realignments in the fractions within the US as well, and how much support does the Trump fraction have, that is also at stake. But what you were saying regarding that this ceasefire and the way it comes to be with Donald Trump first threatening complete annihilation of the Iranian people, basically trying to exert the maximum control through military superiority, but actually the ceasefire and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, even though we need to see how that continues, because that was then threatened almost immediately by the continuing bombings of Israel on Lebanon, that came about by just following Iranian conditions and not by military superiority. So what you were just pointing out and what many analysts are signaling is that maybe this is the instance in which finally what is seen on the table is that military superiority could not just by force the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. That was what the US was threatening. They were capable of doing, and the ground couldn't do it. So that marks like a breaking point in terms of how they're moving forward and how everyone, as you were saying, is positioned on this table. Of course, the United States will need to see what happens in the following weeks, but they went very hard in their intent of reinforcing their control and their supremacy on a world that was shifting towards multipolarity, that was shifting towards other ways of just what marks the flows of the not only energy markets but world markets in general, where the United States is not the only unipolar power of the world. They are trying to retake that place, and they are finding themselves in these situations that do not go as planned, at least from the very beginning, and then the objectives keep on changing, and then we come to a ceasefire that they present as a win, but actually is just reinforcing the fact that the ones in charge of that strait were the Iranians. So from China, is that seen as an opportunity, like for the years to come? Do you see that this is shifting towards a way in which these other countries are going to continue their cooperation in terms of other ways of just controlling the flow of goods and markets? Do you think that China is strengthened after this conflict in the Middle East?
Yeah, of course. I think that might be one of the biggest lesson we learned from the war is going on in Iran. Even before the war, that China has already prepared trying to prepare some alternatives to the petrodollar system. I think the one of the milestone was in the Russian-Ukraine war. Even before the Russian-Ukraine war, China has already prepared a system called SIPS. Which can serve as an alternative to the SWIFT system. So that the technology is already there, but the only issue before is like not a lot of players is using that. But when after the outbreak of the Russian-Ukraine war, because the US is trying to kick Russia out of the SWIFT system. So Russia is forced to turn to other alternatives, so which includes China's SIP system. So before the war, I mean before the Russia-Ukraine war, like a large share of the China-Russian trade has been settled in US dollar or in euros. But after that, at this moment now, I think it's almost like 100% of the China-Russian trade has been settled in either RMB or the Russian's currency. And also, I think the China's trade with Iran is also another good example. Like the oil trade between China and Iran are settled in RMB through the Bank of Kunlun, which is kind of like a small regional bank in China, which is already sanctioned by the U.S. for many years, but it works for many years. So I think these are China's trade, and also these financial systems has already proved to the world that we have alternatives to the US dollar system, to the petrodollar system, and these are already like feasible. If all the countries want to use that, and the solution is already there. And also, I just forgot to mention that the report by the Citrine Research, they mentioned that how these countries paying paying the transit fee to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Some countries are paying RMB or digital currencies, or some like maybe digital cryptos. And some countries, they are trying to get some partial sanction relief of Iran, like they are unfreezing Iran's assets, which is saved in overseas banks. So that's another way that countries can trade and deal with Iran without using without the US dollar, any US dollar exposure. So if you have the true demand for trade, true demand for oil or other energy supplies or anything, it doesn't matter like which way you pay it. There's like 100 ways you can bypass the petrodollar system, to bypass the US dollar system, as long as you have the true demand of the goods. So the goods is actually the foundation, not the currency. So I think that opens up a new opportunity for all these countries beyond the original petrodollar system. So I want to move a little bit back to the Latin America, because we know that all these things going on, and we have the Venezuela kidnapping of the president at the beginning of the year. It already seems like a long time ago. And we also know that there's a lot of pressure going on in Cuba, because Trump is trying to win everywhere, but actually he's not winning anywhere. But that Cuba is like the closest neighbor he can put an eye on. So people in China are very concerned of what's the current situation in Cuba and in Venezuela, because there is very limited information online we can find. We don't know which one is reliable, and it seems like there's a lot of like scams and fake news transit online everywhere. So we were very curious about what things are going on the ground, Ballum.
Of course, and while you were pointing to some of the most important things to follow, there's a lot of what many people are calling media wars, this war of information as well, and the impossibility sometimes to just bring real information from what is happening on the ground to other parts of the world, and how the controlling of those narratives is key to imposing one view of the world. So what is happening in Latin America, of course, Latin America has been shocked by this 2026, and particularly by the increased U.S. aggression from January 3rd. You were saying it seems like so long ago, and it really does. So let's focus in on Venezuela and Cuba right now. You started this conversation talking about the shooting and no shooting wars, and I think that is key to understand what is happening. I think that in Venezuela and Iran, we saw a combination of both, because we need to understand and remind ourselves that these attacks, the military attacks in this case, January 3rd on Venezuela, and then what we were just talking about in Iran, they do not come without a series and years of sanctions before. They are done on weakened economies that are not weakened by themselves, but because of this targeted sanctions that are particularly seeking these outcomes, an outcome of just hindering the possibility of an economy developing its own strategic resources, its own capability of caring for its own population. And that is a strategic intent that even if you go to discussions in the US Senate, for example, you'll see different ministers, for example, just explaining this outright, saying that we are doing the sanctions to target this and obtain this objective that will have these social repercussions, for example. So the attack on Venezuela of January 3rd comes after an escalation of sanctions that lasted close to a decade, and then came the military operation. We had the military buildup of over 6 months before that, and that really, it shifted. I think that we'll remember that moment, like in Latin American history forever. It's the first time that the United States bombs, not the first time it intervenes, not the first time the army gets to the ground, but the first time it bombs a country in South America. And it shifts the way that this region is continuously and with very much difficulties related to the United States. Well, of course, the main consequence of that was the kidnapping of President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady and National Assembly member Cilia Flores. That continues to be the case. But Venezuela, if we follow that course, has taken a path of reinforcing its own institutionality. The acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, has followed the constitutional order. She was executive vice president. She had been for many years to President Maduro, and she continues to reinforce from the swearing in to this moment that he holds the charge of the constitutional presidency, but she is stepping in as acting president in order to continue the line and try to continue to reinforce the capability of Venezuela of being able to decide on its own resources, on its own path, seeing how they can maneuver while they continue to demand for the release of President Nicolás Maduro and engage in what they are calling the peaceful diplomacy, the idea that in the face of that harsh military attack, of course, of military superiority from the United States, we're talking about military world power against developing countries of the global South, against that military force, just relying on the peaceful democracy and diplomacy of continuing negotiations, continuing the demands in international forums, and continue to defend the project from within. So we've seen both negotiations, the sanctionings of different laws that go into just carrying Venezuela into a moment of stabilization, of continuing growth, because Venezuela was seeing for the past years, and despite the sanctions, a period of growth, for example, in its oil production that had been very harshly hit and very harshly targeted by the sanctions that we were mentioning before. So that is the situation on the ground. It's a situation of stability, of negotiations, of trying to reshape the path of that country without losing sovereignty, and understanding that they are overcoming one of the harshest attacks from the United States on the ground, and that has of course shifted, but that project continues. That is the challenge, and that is what we're seeing in Venezuela. Very interesting to see. Also, if we think of like what would happen to any other country after a decade of sanctions on its most vital resources, and then a direct military attack on and the kidnapping of its constitutional president. It's unprecedented. We haven't seen it, and still what we see is a project that is ongoing and a calm and stable situation in terms of the population. So that is something to really follow, to see what happens in Venezuela in this case. And in Cuba, we have a different situation because, of course, first of all, the no shooting wars, the wars of sanctions, of unilateral coercive measures in Cuba has had its longest history, right? The longest blockade that was sanctioned for over 6 decades. And we need to understand that when we talk about a 6-decade-long blockade on Cuba, we're not talking about just a couple of measures that were sanctioned and just remained there for 6 decades. No, this is something that is always changing, always adopting new measures that are specifically targeted at every moment in history to try to cut any possible route that Cuba may have of developing just its own economy, its own industry in particular, getting its own funding for different capabilities and research projects that it might have. It's targeted sanctions that try to hinder that growth, long-standing for 6 decades. And at this moment, what we have is that this is just put at its maximum point. We do not have, it's of the 3 cases that we have been seeing so far, we have not had an active shooting war. We have not had an active military operation on the island, although President Donald Trump has been very insistent in the past weeks to at least play with, suggest with the possibility. Of course, these are ongoing threats. Similar tactic that he used for the months that led to the military attack on Venezuela, a constant reminder and constant being on the headlines saying, we might take Cuba, we might not take Cuba, it might be a military attack, it might not be a military attack. They are working on that pressure tactic that is also a psychological pressure for a population that is constantly seeing this in the headlines, the threat of a possible attack that has not taken shape, of course, but is always there, like looming in the horizon, and the just ramping up of that long-standing blockade in its most crude, like open way. What shifted we were saying Venezuela was at the beginning of January. At the end of January, Trump comes out with the oil blockade of Cuba. He is saying openly that they were not going to allow any country to send any form of oil to the island, both by selling, giving, solidarity, sending, shipments. Anything was off the table just because this was an emergency and threat by the United States. That is a very open way to expose a blockade that has already been ongoing for decades. But the United States was always very cautious in the terms of, like, in the international forum, in the United Nations, for example. The United States always wanted to, in a way, to hide the blockade. They didn't want to openly say that they were just blocking the access to something that directly hits the population of Cuba. They always wanted to say that these were already and only measures that were targeting the possibility of a specific government to develop its own policies, but not targeting the Cuban population. Of course, this was false. Of course, Cuba every year went to the United Nations with numbers, concrete evidence of how this was targeting the population. But in their discourse, the United States tried to hide that fact. Well, with Trump, that changed, as it has with every other topic. He was openly calling for a blockade that had humanitarian consequences. It only took, I think, days for the United Nations to say that this went against international law, and this was the threat of unleashing a humanitarian crisis on a country. Let's keep in mind that blocking the entry of oil into a country that only produces a very small amount of what it needs to power itself to live, it means cutting off essential services, the possibility, for example, not only for the hospitals to run, but also for the water systems to pump, also for the food and just merchandise in general to move around the island and be able to get from the ports to the different sectors of the population. It's literally hindering the possibility of people getting food, and this is just being said out in the open. So that happened at the end of January. Then the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel, said in March that for the past 3 months, Cuba had not received any oil shipment. This was interrupted by one oil shipment sent from Russia. That was so far the only shipment that bypassed the Trump blockade. And of course, this all done by the United States, threatening on every other country with sanctions. Again, we refer to the no shooting wars in an attempt to isolate Cuba. So what we're seeing on the ground is a very, very critical situation. It's not a situation of collapse, as many of the Western media narratives are trying to impose. It's not. The hospitals are running, but they are not able to tend to they are just needing to focus on emergencies. Of course, they are needing to reduce anything that can be postponed is being postponed. And of course, that will have a long-term effect on the population. But they are still tending to emergencies. The schools are open, but the universities, for example, had to close and go to a period of online education, as, for example, we had in the pandemic across the world. So we are having direct impacts and a very critical situation that is trying to be solved by the government day to day. There's an important bet on the solar power system, the idea of clean energy replacing what was before produced by oil. But of course, that takes time. That does not replace the entirety of the power grid. So on the ground, we are seeing long-term blackouts that last up to more than, we're talking 10 hours, 15 hours a day. These has been impacting all sectors of the population, and the people are trying to manage as best they can on a situation that is a direct consequence of that blockade that was just the last straw of the 6-decade-long blockade. So that is what we are seeing, and it's really something to follow, because we were talking before about how the situation in the world was turning to a lot of different countries being able to cooperate among them and bypass the US control, right? So I think that the United States understands really well that cooperation between countries is the way in which the global South can develop, and can develop even besides the US-imposed sanctions. So in Latin America in particular, the area that the United States understands as its closest area of influence. They understand that if they are going to lose their unipolar power across the world, this is the area that they need to secure. So what are they doing? They are particularly targeting any ties of solidarity. They are trying to hinder any form of cooperation between these nations. That is why they are pressuring on Mexico, for example, not to send any more oil shipments to Cuba. That is why they are trying to break bonds within Latin America, because the moment in which Latin America had its strongest bonds was the moment that it had its strongest force to oppose the US mandates for the region. So I think that they are really trying to enforce their control by trying to isolate the different countries that may oppose the US system, and Cuba has always been like a specific case in that regard, almost a symbol of that power and that capability of resistance. So I think that that is happening and it's ongoing. So we need to continue to see day to day if the ties of solidarity, because we have seen solidarity among the people of the global south come to Cuba with aid and understand that this is something that is not about Cuba, but just about how that symbolizes the way and the idea to enforce control over the global south in order to just push back on that attempt to cut those ties of cooperation. So I think that is what we need to see in terms of how that develops. Now, Tiancheng, how is that seen from China? Is there, I know we are far away, and of course with the Iran situation, that is closer by to the impact that it means for the Chinese population, for example. But is the situation in Latin America, that is a region that China has been increasingly engaging with, is this a matter of concern? Do you see maybe the possibility of China stepping in this situation that is being unleashed in Latin America?
I hope so. I can only say I hope so. So it is said that in these kind of like talk between Iran and the US, it is reported that China stepped in at the very last minutes and play some role to make this talk happen. So I'm not sure if this is going to be a sign of the any like future action might be taken by Chinese government, but I can see that among the Chinese like ordinary people, like as I said before, like people are very concerned of what is going on in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Latin America, and of course like in Iran, and there is some some people are keep talking online, like some KOLs and some bloggers and also some maybe famous scholars saying that are urging that the Chinese government should maybe take further steps on the international stage. That is no longer like it's no longer a regional issue. It's no longer an isolated issue. Like everyone is gonna to be affected by all these conflicts, especially the war in Iran. Like maybe China is the least impacted country, the least impacted nation, but we cannot like it's not like no impact at all. It's already like we can see a global energy crisis on the way, and also maybe a global food crisis on the way, and as long as China is still part of the global economic order, like it's not like you can just like stay alone and just like watching everything happen like outside China. Is yeah, I don't think that's possible in the future. But I'm not sure, like as we talked like before for many times, like Chinese governments has always been very cautious of like how to act internationally. So we will see. But I think maybe the war in Iran kind of like speed up everything, kind of like accelerate everything, the process of the world order changing from unipolar to multipolar, and that may kind of like change and shape China's future policy directions. I would say that this is definitely like one of the uh, one of the biggest possibility I want to see for the future.
I was really resonating with that idea that you were just saying of this being a speeding up process, right? I think that that is one of the keys to understand what is happening. This idea of the United States faced with a situation in which the world was slowly transitioning from a unipolar to a multipolar world with every consequence that that might have, and them taking a lot of steps that end up accelerating a process, be it that they regain some of the control, be it that they speed up that process of transition. But definitely what we are seeing is a lot of different processes that were just happening over decades suddenly happening over a 3-month period.
Yeah, sure. I want to follow up a little bit on the situation in Cuba. Like Belen, you're saying that people are struggling but not collapsing. So what are people's expectation that that the local ordinary people, like do they still have faith that the government can hold up under this critical situation, or are they expect that maybe it will be a regime change in Cuba?
I was mentioning before the idea of this not being a collapse because that has been a narrative that the Western media has reported on, and almost I think since February, just weeks after the U.S. statement imposing that oil blockade, they were even almost trying to make that happen. They were reporting on a situation of collapse, so you would see headlines that pointing to everything will shut down. This is the final week. After this week, you'll have no hospitals, no food, no water. Well, that is not the situation. The situation, of course, is very critical, as I was saying, and it's a situation of a lot of need because the vital resources are very much scarce. The availability of them, because of the oil blockade, are very much scarce, and they are being to be rationalized to a maximum point. And that situation is very hard to endure, and of course, very hard to think and analyze how it will continue as you see that the months go by and the US does not soften that grip on the not allowing any form of oil shipment to the country. So that was the difference between the critical situation but not a situation of collapse. Of course, day-to-day life has been harshened a lot, and it is very difficult for everyone to just follow their normal life, from cooking to going to work to going to school. Every aspect of life is directly hit. It was always directly hit by the 6-decade-long blockade, but in particular, this has been hit by this oil blockade imposed since January that was actually in force without the statement from weeks before. And the people are very much frustrated with this, as anyone would be, and this is a present thing also in the government statements that they are saying, like, we understand people are frustrated, we understand that no one wants to live without energy supply, and without the possibility of thinking how this could overcome, because you are a direct consequence of the decision of a foreign government that happens to be also a military superpower, and they've decided to cut off any input of oil, that vital supply to the country. That is, I think, from a humane point of view, very much understandable. Now, I think one thing to keep in mind is the resilience of the population. I think it's different to any other form of resilience in the world. The experience of Cuba is particularly unique to Cuba, and that gives them not only the endurance capacity, but also the practical knowledge of how to rationalize the small amount of oil that Cuba produces itself. It's been able to do a lot with that amount, also adding the energy produced by the solar systems, for example, the solar panels that have been installed for the past years, and of course, particularly in these last months. And all of that gives a capacity of endurance that I think it's very hard to understand from the outside looking in, just because of, I think this could not be translated to any other country, any other situation, because the history of Cuba cannot be translated. So, of course, there's a lot of frustration with the situation. There is also a lot of strong and particularly reborn nationalism and anti-imperialism following the attacks of January 3rd. I think that is also something to keep in mind, because as I was saying, one of the strategic points of the US blockade always was to try to sort of hide that blockade, make it seem as if this was just the wrongdoings of a government that was failing in general, and that was what was driving all of the difficulties for the population. That was always the US narrative. But then with this new version of the Trump oil blockade, they are openly saying, we are doing this. We want you to suffer all these consequences. So for the feeling of the population, of course, that brings out a newborn nationalism. I think the Cubans are very proud of their nationality and their particular history, of a sentiment of saying, like, no, you cannot do this. So I think that both sentiments are coinciding, again, at a very, very difficult time. We can never put aside the human impact of what the toll it takes on the population to not be able to get to work, maybe, and not be able to know how that will be resolved, and knowing that this is at the hands of a foreign power of the world. That brings up a lot of frustration, it brings up a lot of anger, it brings up a lot of resilience as well. I think that is something to keep in mind, and of course to see how it happens. But particularly at an international scene, what we need to think is no population should be put through this because of a specific tactic that a global power is trying to impose its own control. That should be the focus in general when we're analyzing what happens in Cuba.
Yeah, definitely. Because like most of the news I can find about Venezuela and about Cuba online, like most of it is talking about like how Venezuela has already collapsed and Cuba is like on the verge of collapse. And I kind of like doubts that that's only part of the media wars going on. That's part of the propaganda war. But I could not find much reliable public available information online. So that's the meaning of our talk.
And I think that something of what you were saying is so interesting to think about, how much of global media, particularly from the North, works. When you were saying like
Yeah.
they are presenting a narrative in which the global South in many cases disappears, as if you had just one actor, the United States, doing things, good, bad, like however you want to present them, and the people of the global South have no part in that narrative. The United States attacks and the others collapse. The United States attacks and the others like have no resistance, have no fighting back, have no construction of their own, have no populations processing all those situations. It's as if we were seeing a narrative with just one actor in mind. And even though the United States has been the strongest power for decades and now is at a moment of transition of that unipolar power, it does not dominate the complete narrative. It's not the only player at hand. And I think that the global South has had a lot of experiences of that. And that is what we are seeing. How can we understand everything that is going on right now with the United States being one of the strongest players, but not the only one? So you have acts of resistance, you have acts of cooperation, you have projects that continue their own process in different ways in the face of those US attacks. So that is a little bit of what is happening. Any final thoughts, Tianjiang, for today? Such a great conversation.
I think we had a lot. We had enough today. Yeah. I'm still like trying to think about what you just brought up. Yeah.
We definitely had a lot to unpack, and we'll probably continue thinking about this that has marked this 2026. It will continue to shape what happens, and we'll definitely come back to this table, to both tables, to understand how this continues to impact the different corners of the world. It's been a pleasure, and this was another episode of Overlap.
And that's it for today. A lot to think about and definitely more to watch in the days ahead. Remember to send in your comments, your thoughts, your feedback and suggestions for the coming episodes of the show through the email provided below. Thank you so much for joining us for today's edition of China Now. I hope you had a good time as always. My name is Makiza Latifa and I'll see you same time next week here on China Now.